From the frozen plains of Eastern Europe to the corridors of power in Moscow and Brussels, the geopolitical landscape is shifting. At its center stands the uneasy relationship between Vladimir Putin's Russia and its long-standing ally, Belarus. A relationship whose unraveling signals something far greater than one country's drift. It heralds a moment when the grip of Russia over Europe, once presumed unshakable, shows cracks. In this vast rearrangement of power, Belarus emerges as the unexpected vector of change. For decades, Belarus had occupied a position of strategic symbiosis with Russia. Under Alexander Lukashenko, the country maintained a role as Moscow's loyal partner. Its economic dependence, security alignment and proximity to NATO's eastern flank made it Moscow's rear-guard anchor in Europe. And yet, though the structural ties seemed ironclad, new currents began to flow. The war in Ukraine, economic sanctions, internal pressures and diplomatic reorientation combined to erode the formerly stable system. The result? Putin's influence in Europe is no longer the monolith it once was. The historical backdrop is important. Belarus had long flirted with a multi-vector foreign policy, balancing ties between Russia and the West, but from around 2020 onward the balance tipped sharply toward Moscow. Belarus became an operational staging ground for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Its territory and infrastructure were used by Russian forces. Belarus's own constitution was amended to permit foreign, that is, Russian deployment of non-strategic nuclear weapons. In that moment, Belarus seemed fully subsumed into Russia's imperial orbit. Yet beneath the surface, forces of dissociation were stirring. The longer Russia's war dragged on, the more costly the alliance for Minsk. Economic dependence deepened rather than stabilized. Belarus found itself increasingly isolated from the European sphere and progressively tied to Moscow's fate. At the same time, the West began to recognize Belarus not only as a subordinate partner of Russia, but also as a potential independent actor whose choice might tip the strategic balance. In 2025, a series of diplomatic, strategic and internal moves pointed toward Belarus seeking a measure of autonomy. While Moscow remained dominant, Minsk began to signal that its interests might diverge. Western commentators argue that the European Union must adopt a new approach, recognizing that Belarus's sovereignty is not only a normative goal, but a strategic one. A free and independent Belarus will make Europe safer, reads one policy brief. In other words, Belarus breaking away from Russia's direct orbit weakens the specter of Russian dominion across the eastern flank of Europe. Why does this matter to Putin's grip on Europe? First, geopolitically, Russia had counted on Belarus as a buffer, a base, and a forward platform. Belarus's territory gives Moscow convenient geographic depth. Its location between Russia and Europe means control there enables pressure on the Baltic states, Poland, and the EU's eastern border. The concept of the Suwalki Gap, the narrow land link between Poland and Lithuania that separates the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad from the rest of NATO, is directly implicated. Belarus's cooperation makes Russian threat vectors far more credible. If Belarus begins to diverge, that buffer falls away. Second, symbolically, Russia's influence in the post-Soviet space is as much about projection of power as it is about territory. If Belarus steps away, even partially, it signals to other states that the Russian sphere is not unassailable. That opens cracks in the overall architecture of Russian dominance. Third, economically and militarily, Belarus's move forces Russia to recalibrate. Moscow may have to reallocate resources, reinforce its bases, deepen dependencies. With its economy already strained by sanctions and war, the loss or loosening of Belarus as a reliable partner is a strategic cost. What are the signs of Belarus's disengagement? They are subtle but meaningful. 1. Belarus has started outreach to the West and sought to moderate its posture, releasing some political prisoners, seeking economic relief, engaging in diplomacy that bypasses Moscow's direct approval. 2. Belarus has expressed ambivalence about being an unquestioning pawn in Moscow's war effort. Although it hosted Russian troops, Minsk has sought to preserve its own regime survival logic, rather than join wholeheartedly as a combatant. 3. Analysts note that Belarus's internal economic and demographic pressures, the shortage of labor, inflation, dependency on Russian subsidies, have sparked a rethinking in Minsk about the cost of its alignment. Putin's regime, for its part, faces constraints. Living standards in Russia are under strain, mobilization is unpopular, the war is costly. Russia cannot absorb the cost of a full integration of Belarus without risk. Indeed, analysts have argued that Putin has no clear options in Belarus, since intervention would be politically and economically risky. Yet, if he loses Belarus, the strategic loss is real. For Europe, this shift offers both opportunity and risk. Opportunity, if Belarus can be drawn into a relationship of strategic autonomy, less dependent on Russia, more responsive to EU and Western overtures, then the eastern flank becomes less of a Russian playground. The EU think tank World argues that the West should shift from purely punitive sanctions to a conditional engagement that uses incentives to pull Minsk away from Moscow. Risk, if Belarus falls into deeper Russian control or collapses into chaos, Moscow could double down, using Belarus as a launchpad for further aggression. The so-called Bye-bye Belarus scenario warns of Russia annexing or more fully integrating Belarus. In short, the weakening of Russia's grip on Europe begins with the loosening of its hold over Belarus. But make no mistake, this is not a clean break. Belarus hasn't declared independence from Russia. It remains economically tethered, security-linked, and politically repressive under Lukashenko. What is changing is the calculation. Minsk may be shifting from total obedience to conditional alignment. This shift rattles Moscow's expectations. Let us walk through how this evolution plays out. Paragraph 1. Imagine the map of Europe in 2014 to 2021. Russia invades Ukraine in 2014, annexes Crimea, war in Donbass drags on. Belarus remains Russia's handmaiden, hosting Russian bases, buying Russian gas at discounts, political alignment. Russia seems resurgent, its sphere of influence intact. Paragraph 2. From 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia presses sanctions mount. Belarus allows Russia to use its territory as staging ground. Belarus becomes more deeply integrated, its constitution amended to allow nuclear weapons, its sovereignty visibly eroded. But inside, the cost is rising. Paragraph 3. By 2023 to 2024, sanctions hit Russia, its economy slows, its manpower issues mount. Europe and NATO reinforce their eastern flank. Belarus, meanwhile, sees the burden, economy overdependent, youth emigrating, Belarus's own identity suppressed. Lukashenko fears becoming the junior partner to a faltering Russia. Paragraph 4, 2025 unfolds. Europe realizes Belarus may be open to engagement. Papers and briefings declare that a free Belarus is a strategic asset. Minsk releases political prisoners, opens back channels, signals interest in diversified ties. The dynamic changes. Russia's monopoly on influence weakens. Putin's leverage is less certain. Paragraph 5. What does this mean for Europe? First, the eastern flank is less dominated by an unchallenged Russian sphere. That gives NATO and EU members more strategic room. Second, it means Russia cannot as easily threaten or destabilize Europe via Belarus without risking loss of control. Third, the possibility of Belarus aligning more with Europe introduces new economic and security options, pipelines, commerce, transit, diplomacy. Paragraph 6. But pitfalls remain. Belarus remains authoritarian, its democracy frozen, its opposition in exile. Russia still has the trump cards, subsidies, military bases, cultural linguistic links. If Minsk shifts too much, Moscow could retaliate. If Minsk diverges too little, Europe's window closes. The balancing act is delicate. Paragraph 7. The message to Putin is clear: the era of easy sway is over. Europe is no longer a stage on which Moscow has unchecked backstage control. Belarus's drift, or at least readiness to drift, signals that the Russian sphere is brittle. For a man whose power rests on restoration of Russian greatness, this is a warning. The architecture built on fear, subjugation, energy dominance and regional dependency is increasingly vulnerable. Paragraph 8. For Europe, the message is hopeful, if cautious. The moment is not one of triumph, but of potential. The chance to draw Belarus into a more open orbit, to reduce Russian leverage, to stabilize the eastern border. That moment is present, but it demands clarity of strategy, unity of purpose, and readiness to engage. Sanctions remain necessary, but so does diplomacy. Engagement must be conditional, aligned with reforms, security commitments, and respect for sovereignty. Paragraph 9. As a motivational point for viewers, this is the power of autonomy. The story of Belarus is not simply about big powers clashing, it is the story of a smaller state recognizing that total dependency is untenable, that sovereignty is a strategic asset, that alignment must be more dynamic than subservience. In your own life, the lesson is analogous. When you sense that a long-standing dependency or pattern is pulling you off your true path, realizing that slight shift matters. Autonomy doesn't always mean a grand break. Often it means choosing your alignment, renegotiating your terms, recognizing the moment when what once seemed fixed begins to move. Paragraph 10. So when we speak of Putin's grip on Europe weakening, let us not imagine dramatic collapses overnight. Rather, let us picture gradual loosening, subtle disengagements, shifting alliances. Belarus is a hinge point. Its choice is not yet final, but its options are expanding. And when a state at the heart of Russia's strategic web begins to waver, the edifice begins to quake. Paragraph 11. The coming months and years will determine whether Belarus moves toward genuine autonomy or deeper integration with Russia, or something in between. Europe's response will matter. If the EU and NATO offer a credible alternative, if Brussels and capitals engage pragmatically, Belarus may tilt westward. If not, Moscow will tighten the screws. And for Putin, the window to restore control may be closing. Paragraph 12. In conclusion, this story is about power, geopolitical, institutional, personal. It is about the way empires maintain influence, the way states negotiate dependencies, and the way the ripple of one country's shift can alter the broader tectonic plates of international order. It is about the weakening of a once dominant force and the emergence of openings. It is about possibility. In the final analysis, Putin's grip on Europe is weakening not because of one failed campaign or one diplomatic setback, but because the architecture of influence is fracturing at its seams. And Belarus is the crack. If Europe seizes the moment, the map of influence could be redrawn. And if you seize your moment of leverage in life, the map of your own influence can be redrawn too.